Mind and all mental phenomena cannot possibly receive explanation or description in physical-chemical terms, but that would amount to explaining something by an instrument which is itself the product of the thing to be explained.
Cognitive dissonance theory is vitally more important in explaining the liberal left's mindset than many in the new right can appreciate. Although frequently invoked by mainstream conservatives to ostensibly criticize liberals' incoherence and hypocrisy, cognitive dissonance should be applied more broadly and explored more deeply than it is. According to psychologists, the dissonance produced in the mind when holding mutually exclusive beliefs causes a unique form of mental trauma. Facts and opinions which challenge, for instance, one's self-identity or long-held conventional wisdom can, according to research, result in agony for the afflicted, producing a feeling of desperation akin to starvation or intense thirst. Unsurprisingly then, the resulting discomfort can push the sufferer to great lengths of irrational and extreme behavior in order to obtain relief. Understanding cognitive dissonance, therefore, can assist in explaining our cultural opponents' aggressiveness and, given the increasing unreality of postmodern Western society, their increasingly toxic and desperate behavior. A basic theme within cognitive dissonance literature is that the brain cannot stand sustained ideational conflict. So hard does the brain work towards resolving it, its neural circuitry will actually employ faulty reasoning in order to shut down the distress. When presented with contradictory positions, it will in effect blind itself to them, for instance, by eliminating the new conflicting belief while clinging to the challenged one. Referring to this characteristic of mind as our totalitarian ego, psychologist Anthony Greenwald writes that the mind's biases are firmly enslaved to the ego's greater central design, such as one's self-image as a humanitarian or morally righteous person. This helps explain much of the liberals' hyper-defensive reaction towards evidence regarding racial differences, for example. Political psychology professor Drew Weston has found that the same brain circuits activating biased reasoning are the very same which operate in those of drug addicts while getting high. Like junkies, the cognitively conflicted will do anything to return to a state of comfort and euphoria. Their minds will employ numerous stress responses when, for instance, long-held beliefs or self-image are challenged, such as avoiding the conflicting evidence in question and its source, resorting to self-denial or magical thinking, and even intentionally misremembering or suppressing past experiences and observations. Then, when confronted by ideological opponents, the afflicted can resort to convoluted fantastical arguments, to hostile or nakedly diversionary ones. As cognitive dissonance expert Margaret Heffernan states, humans are prepared to pay a very high price to preserve their most cherished ideas. The case studies which establish cognitive dissonance theory bear many of these hallmarks. In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger became intrigued with a news story about a doomsday cult, whose leader claimed she had received messages from a UFO about an impending flooding of the Earth. Festinger was struck by the question of what would happen when a deeply held belief was refuted by events. Posing as a believer, he began attending the group's meetings, including what became the final meeting on the eve of the world's end. When no floods came, the cult's founder miraculously received a new message, that due to their virtuosity, the world had been saved. As he wrote in his book about the case, entitled When Prophecy Fails, far from being unswayed, the cult felt joyous that their belief system still remained intact, and became even more adamant in their convictions. Those researching the foundations of cognitive dissonance often cite the work of the late Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner when explaining various biases that can occupy the mind. A pioneer of what is now referred to as positive-negative reinforcement, Skinner conducted experiments in the 1930s, wherein he placed a hungry rat inside a box with a lever which, when pressed, delivered food. The rodent soon learned to associate the action with the reward. Different colored lights were then introduced, with the rat receiving food only when a certain light was on. Whenever the rat pressed the lever at the correct time, it received food, and when it did not, it received an electric shock. Gradually, this had the effect of teaching the rodent to associate certain stimuli with reward and pain. As Skinner and other psychologists later proved, such behavioral conditioning was usable on human beings as well. Years later, after applying this model of behavioral modification to personal views and opinions, psychologist Judson Brewer stated that the more positive and negative reinforcement is repeated, such as publicly praising and scolding someone, humans could be made to internalize specific social views or develop a predisposed lens through which to see the world. Over time, the subject becomes no longer aware of these filters, and simply believes that his view of things is independent and self-determined. There are two dissonance-inducing stress responses acknowledged by analysts, which also deserve greater understanding. The active mind's ability to adjust value to challenging cognitions, and its capacity to add novel cognitions to outweigh challenging ones, the study of which will hopefully explain how white liberals, who do not betray their own observational faculties, while internally acknowledging innate race differences, can nonetheless zealously pursue the equality is right, diversity is our strength, anti-Western worldview. Regarding the former, intellectually dishonest white liberals may adjust down the importance that IQ disparities play in society, thereby reducing their discomfort by explaining how they can be overcome through better diet in childhood or increased investment in inner urban education. This reduces the cogdis between the competing views that they internally acknowledge, while sustaining the more socially acceptable equality-diversity worldview. In the latter, similarly situated white liberals will add new cognitions, for instance, by adopting the notion that regardless of the reality of race, European nationalists only wish harm towards non-whites and therefore must be countered socially and politically. Again, the mental anguish of dealing with these uncomfortable choices is therefore resolved. Although blocking out evidence disruptive to one's sense of self can, in theory, also apply to European cultural advocates, it is important to note why it's largely a white liberal phenomenon. Such persons operate in a constant state of neurotic discomfort and uncertainty. Upon observing wildly different behavioral patterns of, let's say, POCs in public or the workplace, tracking the disparate levels of black achievement in school and professional life, or experiencing instances of anti-white intimidation and violence, for white liberals, these pose challenges to their worldview, which they then can only find relief from via the politically correct explanations of systemic racial inequality or white privilege. This simply doesn't apply to white advocates. Although extensive, our daily discomforts are not neurotic, relating to very real, uncontrived worries, such as the concern for our families' futures or the continuance of our people and culture. None of these are pathological sensibilities. Furthermore, the collective engineering of attitudes is simply too difficult to graft onto white advocates. Despite some group spaces where the echo chamber effect has had a restrictive influence, whatever the reason, European cultural advocates most often carry the critical faculties needed to avoid general social conditioning, whether this is due to a greater awareness of personal subversion, a natural intolerance to opinions based on faith, or simply due to a healthy genetic ethnocentric tendency in some Europeans to recoil from ideas hostile to their group self-interest. Present-day white advocates are keenly indisposed to any social conditioning. The institutional foundations that undergird white liberal worldviews are now legion, and at present, the equality-diversity paradigm reigns supreme inside every major establishment in the West. Numerous sources, particularly the mainstream media, operate daily to provide the reinforcement, assurance, and social pressure that white liberals need to stay on point. Needless to say, this full-spectrum support for cognitive dissonance simply does not apply to European nationalists, for we now no longer control and direct Western institutions, whose values were fundamentally altered to oppose European cultural protections. Nor do we as a group subscribe to the postmodern orthodoxies' notions of respectability, virtue signaling, or approved social association, because in the face of these institutional threats, we were forced to build new ideals upon intellectually serious, pragmatic concepts. In summation, although paper-thin and routinely challenged, the white liberal paradigm rests on a flimsy foundation, one that requires continuous maintenance and institutional endorsement. By contrast, the realist worldview of European advocates is given no cultural assistance, having no social benefits, only the bracing satisfaction of living in accordance with the truth and being loyal to it gives us the sense of well-being that we need in this existential war. And, as in all things modern, there is a cautionary apologue. The liberal paradigm will continue to develop cracks as its contradictions to reality within Western society increase. The fear and anguish caused by the collective cogdis will become increasingly externalized, pathologizing every facet of the establishment's cultural power against our existence. Ever more hysterical calls and campaigns for our moral exclusion will most certainly occur, and, ever more probable now, so will the appeal for our outright extermination.